The night of the binding oath, every torch in Stormveld burned bright, and Sigrid stood in the shadows of the eastern colonnade, watching the man she had pulled from the frozen forest kneel before his court and name another woman as his intended. She did not cry. She did not beg. She pressed one hand flat against her chest, held her spine straight, and walked out through the main gate the next morning in full daylight. No hood, no haste, so that every guard at Stormveld would see her leave. 3 days later, a lone rider arrived at the Northern Conclave without escort, without title, without a crown, carrying nothing but a small linen pouch of winter heather, picked from the exact spot where she had once saved his life. But why did the most powerful Alpha King in the North ride 2 days alone through a snowstorm just to stand outside a gate he was not sure she would open? Watch until the end, and tell me in the comments, would you have opened that gate? The forest did not forgive carelessness. Sigrid had learned that at 9, when she followed her mother into the pine thicket beyond Ulfheim and lost her in the white. She had learned it again at 14, when she set a wrong snare and spent 2 days treating her own infected wrist by firelight, feeding the fire with one good hand while the other swelled in the dark. By 23, the lesson had become so deeply woven into her that she moved through winter woods the way water moves through stone. Not with force, but with exact knowledge of where every gap was, every hollow, every place the ice thinned before it looked like it should. She was crouching beneath a gray pine, reaching for hrosseling, horseheather, the low-growing kind that only survived under the oldest root systems, when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. A change in sound. The forest had been exhaling steadily. Wind through the upper canopy, the slow creak of ice-laden branches bearing weight, the distant percussion of a woodpecker working dead wood 300 or 400 paces north. Then one of those sounds stopped. Not wind, not bird. The quality of attention in the air shifted. Sigrid's hands stilled above the heather. She did not move. She let her breath go quiet and her body go still in the particular way she had practiced since childhood. The way that made her part of the landscape, rather than a thing separate from it. She turned her head, slowly, never fast. Fast tells the forest you are afraid, and afraid, things get eaten. 30 paces north, a man sat against the base of a gray pine. His back was to the bark and one leg was extended at the wrong angle. Not the loose angle of a man resting, but the careful angle of someone managing pain. His head was bowed, dark hair falling across his face, and his left hand was pressed flat against his side, with the unconscious precision of someone who had been maintaining that pressure for hours. Long enough that the hand had stopped being a deliberate decision and become simply the position his body held. Sigrid assessed. Large. Not merely tall, but built wide across the shoulders and chest, in the way of men who had been trained hard since boyhood. The cloak was heavy dark wool, no insignia visible from here, though the quality of the weave was evident even from 30 paces. The sword at his hip was still sheathed. She noted this. A man who wanted to harm her would not have chosen a position bleeding against a tree trunk. He would have chosen concealment, angle, surprise. He was not trying to harm her. He was trying not to be found at all, and failing at it because he was in pain and his control was slipping. She straightened and walked toward him. The snow crunched under her boots. He heard her on the 3rd step. She saw his shoulders change, a subtle gathering of readiness. But he did not reach for the sword. Another point in his favor. "You're breathing wrong," she said when she was 10 paces from him. Her voice came out even, unhurried, which she was quietly proud of. Short and held. That's a rib, or something beside one. If it were a lung, you'd be blue by now, so you're fortunate on that count. The man's head came up. She had seen handsome men before. Ulfheim had its share of them. Raiders' sons grown tall and broad on salted fish and iron training. Men who knew their faces worked in their favor, and spent accordingly. She had learned to look at them the same way she looked at everything else in her professional life, with complete attention and no sentiment, cataloging what was useful and setting aside what was not. So she registered the face without being moved by it. Strong jaw, currently set hard with the effort of not showing how much things hurt. A mouth that might have been generous at rest, compressed now into a line. High cheekbones, dark brows drawn together not in anger, but in the specific concentration of managed pain. And his eyes. Those were harder to register without sentiment. They were the color of winter water at depth. That particular dark gray that was not quite blue and not quite black. The color that had no single name because it depended entirely on the light. They looked at her with an expression that was not fear and not welcome and not surprise. More like assessment returned. He was doing to her exactly what she was doing to him. "I didn't ask for a healer," he said. His voice was rougher than she expected. Not from pain, but from disuse. The voice of a man who was accustomed to being heard when he spoke, and therefore did not often need to speak loudly. The voice of someone who gave orders and did not explain them. "You didn't ask for anything," Sigrid said, crouching in front of him and setting her basket on the snow between them. "That's rather the problem." She looked at his left hand, still flat against his side. "Move that." "I'm fine." "You are very much not fine." She met his eyes without flinching from the weight in them. "I have Yartsmira in this basket. It will close the bleeding. I have dried solblom. It will prevent rot. I have linen strips, and I have time, because it will be dark before I reach Ulfheim, regardless of whether I help you. So I have nothing to lose by stopping." She held his gaze. "You can refuse all of it and ride home, assuming your horse is somewhere nearby, and you can mount it without reopening whatever that is. Or you can move your hand and let me work. Those are the two options. I won't offer a third." The silence between them lasted exactly long enough for her to understand that he was unaccustomed to being spoken to this way and was deciding how he felt about it. Then he moved his hand. The wound was a cut, deep, clean-edged, the kind that came from a blade moving with intention. Not a branch, not a fall. Someone had done this deliberately, recently, within the past several hours, judging by how the blood had moved from active flow to a slow seep. He had pressed the inner fold of his cloak against it, which had been exactly the right instinct, and had probably saved him from much worse blood loss. But the cold had stiffened the tissue around the wound, and if he had ridden any significant distance like this— "How far?" she asked, already opening her basket. Her hands moved without hesitation, locating the Yartsmira by feel, while her eyes stayed on the wound. "What?" "From wherever you were when this happened. How many hours have you been moving with this?" He considered. She could see him weighing what to say, the fractional tightening around his eyes, a brief stillness that was deliberation rather than pain. 3 hours, he said. "Horseback?" "Yes." She let out a breath through her nose, controlled. "Then you're fortunate I'm here and not at the Greyvast crossroads, which I expect was your original direction. Greyvast's healer is competent, but she favors cauterizing deep wounds. You would not have enjoyed that." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement of something. Her bluntness, perhaps, or the accuracy of what she'd said. "No," he agreed. "I wouldn't have." Sigrid tore a strip from the inner lining of her own cloak, clean, undyed wool, the only fabric she trusted against open wounds, and folded it into a compress. She packed the Yartsmira directly into the wound first, pressing firmly with 2 fingers, working the herb paste into the deepest part of the cut, where bleeding tended to continue longest. The man did not make a sound. She could see his hands resting against his thighs. His knuckles were white. "This will hurt more before it helps," she said, without looking up. "I won't apologize for it. I didn't ask for an apology. Most men do. Usually in the form of, 'Are you nearly done?' repeated at intervals. I'm not most men." She glanced up briefly. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. The compression in his eyes had shifted into something more curious, or more interested, or both? She looked back at the wound. "No," she said. "I can see that." She worked in silence for a moment, applying the herb paste in careful layers, building the treatment from the inside out, the way her mother had taught her. The wound was deep, but clean. It would close well if it was kept clean and not aggravated for the next several days. She reached for the solblom, and her fingers brushed the back of his hand. She did not pull away immediately. This was, she would think later, where her caution failed her. Not dramatically, not obviously, just in the small way that mattered. She felt the temperature of his skin, which was warmer than it should have been, given the cold. And she felt the quality of stillness in him, the specific stillness of deliberate choice, rather than absence of reason to move. And for 3 seconds, she did not withdraw her hand. Then she reached for the solblong. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Ulfheim." She applied the second herb over the compress, her hands resuming their professional efficiency. "Healer. I come out here most days when the weather allows. The best frostling in the region grows under those pines." She nodded toward where she had been crouching when she found him. "You came alone." "I come alone most days." "That's not safe." She began binding the compress in place with the linen strips, working the fabric around his torso with practiced efficiency, one hand passing the strip to the other behind his back. This close, she could smell pine resin and wood smoke and cold leather, and beneath all of that, the unmistakable human smell of someone who had been under significant physical stress for several hours. She kept her breathing steady. The forest is more predictable than people. People make choices I can't anticipate. The forest just is what it is. And strange men bleeding against trees? Strange men bleeding against trees, she said, don't typically reach for weapons. Pain is honest. It tells you what something is. She checked the tension of the binding with 2 fingers slipped under the edge. Firm, not restrictive, exactly right. Men who want to hurt you don't bleed first. The last knot tied. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bandaging critically. Clean, firm. It would hold if he did what she was about to tell him. You should not ride tonight, she said. The binding will hold if you stay still, but any significant movement will reopen it. There's a crofter's shelter a 1/4 mile east along the tree line. I've used it before in bad weather. It's dry, and it has a working chimney. Stay there tonight and ride at first light. He looked at her. The late afternoon light had shifted while she worked, moving from pale winter silver into something amber and lower. And it fell across the plains of his face in a way that made him look carved from the mountain rather than born from it. The gray of his eyes had gone warmer in this light, catching amber in the depths of it. Why are you telling me this? He asked. You've treated the wound. You could go. Because it's true, and you need to hear it. She began repacking her basket, settling each item back into its place. Whether you act on it is entirely your concern. She stood, brushed snow from her knees, lifted the basket. She had taken 2 steps away when he spoke again. Sigrid of Ulfheim. She stopped. He had used her full name, the way she'd given it to him, Healer of Ulfheim. And in his mouth, it had a different weight than it had in hers. She could not have said what the difference was, only that it was there. When I return from where I'm going, he said, and his voice had gone quieter, into a register she hadn't heard from him yet. Something that had more weight than his previous sentences, and more space inside it. I'll remember this. It was such a plain sentence. It contained nothing spectacular. She turned to look at him, and found him watching her with the full attention of those extraordinary eyes. Not performing anything, not constructing anything, just meaning what he'd said. It lodged in her chest like a splinter, small, deep, already too embedded to remove without more pain than leaving it alone would cause. See that you remember to breathe correctly, she said, and stay in the shelter. She turned back into the trees and walked. She was 50 paces away before she realized she had never asked his name. She almost turned back, She kept walking. But the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, that 3-second mistake, would not leave her hands for the rest of the long walk home, no matter how many times she pressed them deep into her cloak pockets and thought about something else. She found out 3 days later. A messenger arrived in Ulfheim before mid-morning, bearing a seal she recognized on the folded letter. A wolf's head pressed into dark wax, the sigil of Stormveld Fortress. She had seen it before on official documents, trade agreements, the kind of correspondence that passed through Ulfheim's Elder Council and ended up referenced in her herb room when she needed to understand who owed what to whom and whether she'd be paid for her services. She read the letter standing in her doorway, with the morning cold coming in around her. The Alpha King of Stormveld requests, not summons, the healer Sigrid of Ulfheim to present herself at Stormveld before the next new moon, to discuss the position of head healer, which has been vacant for 2 years. Terms to be negotiated on arrival, according to the healer's requirements. She read it twice, then a third time. The Alpha King of Stormveld. She had packed his wound with Hartsmira and told him to breathe correctly and stay in the shelter. And he had been the Alpha King of Stormveld. She had told him, "I won't apologize for it, and pain is honest and most men are lying." And the entire time, she had simply been speaking to a man she was treating, because that was how she worked. That was her one professional principle. Everyone who came to her was a patient first, and everything else second. She stood in her doorway with the letter in her hands and the cold coming in, and let herself think, carefully and completely, about what had happened in that forest. The wound, the compress, the way her fingers had rested against the back of his hand for 3 seconds longer than necessary. The way he had said, "I'll remember this," with the particular weight of a man who kept his promises. "What did you do, Sigrid?" she asked herself. She finished the tincture she was preparing. She cleaned her workbench. She washed her hands thoroughly. Then she sat by her fire for 2 hours and thought about what she wanted. She packed her bag the next morning, with conditions written on a folded piece of parchment that she intended to hand to whoever received her at the gate. Stormveld was granite and firelight. That was her first impression, and the months that followed did not change it. The fortress rose from the northern rock, as though the rock had simply decided to grow taller in one place. No ornament, no softness. Every angle a decision made in the language of permanence and defense. But inside, fire burned in every hall. Not ceremonially, not decoratively. Constantly, in the practical way of people who had learned long ago that cold was the true enemy, and heat was not a luxury, but a strategy. She arrived with her bag and her folded conditions, and handed both to the steward, a compact, efficient woman named Bera, at the main gate. Bera read the conditions, looked up once over the top of the parchment, with an expression that might have been amusement on a face that allowed itself such things, and said, "He said you'd have something like this." Sigrid did not ask what else he'd said. Are the conditions acceptable? Autonomy over the healing chambers? No orders about patient treatment from anyone, including the king. Continued foraging access to the outer forests. Right to leave if the position proves unsuitable, with 30 days' notice. Bera folded the parchment. Yes, they're acceptable. Then I'll start today. She built her practice in the east wing, where light came through the high windows each morning before it reached anywhere else in the fortress. The previous healer's herb stores were organized by jar size, a system that had apparently made sense to someone at some point, but produced no logic she could find. Bergminta, beside Bay and Veith, beside Brennanetla, with no relationship between them except the accidental rhyme of their names. She spent her first 3 days reorganizing everything by season and use, which required moving nearly every jar in the room. Bera reported, with that near amusement, that this had created some distress among the senior staff who'd known where things were. Sigrid noted the distress, acknowledged it, and did not reverse the reorganization. The fortress population was nearly 200 people. Warriors, servants, craftspeople, families. They had not had consistent medical care in 2 years. The work was not difficult to find. It was everywhere. Winter fever in the lower barracks. 3 untreated injuries among the training yard warriors that had been walked off and were now quietly rotting in the way of improperly managed wounds. A child in the kitchen quarters with a chest complaint that had been dismissed as a cold for 2 months and was becoming something more serious. She worked from before dawn until after dark. She established morning rounds and evening preparation as her fixed routine and declined every invitation to evening meals in the hall on the grounds that she was not yet done with her day. She did not see Halvard for 11 days. When she did, it was at the evening meal in the great hall and only in passing. He entered from the northern door with 3 men she would later come to know as his inner council, crossed the hall without stopping, spoke briefly with a senior guard, and left again. He did not look toward her corner. She told herself this was fine. She was here to work, not for anything else. And in any case, she had nothing to base any other expectation on, except a conversation in a pine forest where she had told him to breathe correctly, and he had said her name as though the syllables meant something. That was not a foundation. That was a moment, and moments were not foundations. She went back to her Bergminta. 2 days later, she was in the herb room at midday, sorting dried Bergminta by quality and scent, separating the good harvest from the mediocre, when the door opened. She did not look up. People came and went throughout the day. She had trained herself to be immovable while working, to give her attention to whatever was in her hands, rather than whatever walked through her door, because healers who were easily distracted made mistakes that cost people. "You rearranged the storage jars," Halvard said. Sigrid looked up. He was in the doorway, not entering, simply present, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, looking at the shelves along the east wall, not at her. At the jars she had reorganized, his expression neutral in the particular way of someone thinking something they have not yet decided to say out loud. He was dressed plainly, dark wool, no armor, no formal bearing, and he looked different from the man she had found bleeding against a tree. He had color back in his face, and he carried himself with the easy authority of someone in his own space, and his eyes, when they finally moved from the shelves to her face, were the same winter water gray she remembered. Warmer here, in this amber-lit room, the amber finding something in the gray that she hadn't seen in the outdoor light. "The previous arrangement was by jar size," she said, looking back at her Bergminta. "Jar size contains no medical information. I sorted by use and season." Bera is annoyed. Bera's system was based on familiarity, not function. She'll adjust in a week and then prefer it. She held a sprig of Bergminta up to the window light to check the color of the dried leaves. "Good harvest, this one." "Your shoulder?" A pause. "Healed. Let me see." She expected the usual resistance. She had it from every patient, some instinct of pride that made men treat an examination like a concession. Instead, he crossed the room without comment, stopped at the work table, and removed the outer layer of his tunic in the practiced way of someone accustomed to field dressings, pulling it over his shoulder and setting it aside. She stood, pushed back her stool, came around the table. The wound had closed cleanly. The edges had knit well, no puckering, no subsurface hardness that would indicate infection brewing out of sight. She pressed 2 fingers along the length of the scar, methodically, checking each section. He did not move or flinch or make the small sounds of protest most patients made. His breathing stayed steady. She moved her examination upward along the rib cage, checking the tissue on both sides of the healed wound, and felt a muscle in his jaw tighten when her fingers passed over healthy skin above the scar. She noted this. She withdrew her hand and came back around the table, putting professional distance between them. "Clean," she said. "You didn't reopen it." "I stayed in the shelter as you told me." He pulled the tunic back on. Then, without obvious transition, "You reorganized my grandfather's apothecary in 11 days. His system was 60 years out of date." It was 60 years old. Inefficiency doesn't improve with age. Neither do improperly labeled jars of Bayenvith in a room where someone might reach for it in low light and pick up Brennanetla instead, which is not fatal but is extremely unpleasant. She sat back down and picked up the Bergmynta. Is there something specific you needed, or? No. He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality, she noticed, of being comfortable in silence. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who did not speak until speaking was worth it. I wanted to see if you'd actually stay. Most healers find reasons to leave within the first month. She looked at him. He was looking at the jars on her shelves, at the organized order she had made from someone else's chaos, at the morning's tinctures cooling in their row of small bottles. I don't leave things unfinished, she said. He nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something. Then he left, and the room held the particular quality of silence that follows when something large and purposeful has been in it. Sigrid sat for a moment with the Bergmynta in her hands. Then she went back to work. She measured the slow months in cases. The warriors began coming to her, not reluctantly, the way men presented themselves to healers when the pain had become impossible to ignore, but as a matter of course. Word had spread through some channel she hadn't engineered. The healer in the East Wing examined what was actually wrong and treated what was actually there, without judgment or condescension, and the treatments worked. By the second month, she had a morning queue most days. Once, before first light, she arrived at the herb room to find a lamp already burning on her work table. Not the dim tallow rushlight she'd been using, which gave enough light to work by if she angled herself carefully and the weather was not too dark. A proper oil lamp, the kind from the main hall, with a wide wick and a polished copper reflector behind the flame that doubled the light. Steady, warm, perfect for close work before dawn. She stood in the doorway looking at it. She had not mentioned the insufficient light to anyone. She had adapted to it, the way she adapted to most things, by working around it. She had not complained, because complaining was not how she solved problems. Someone had noticed anyway. She stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, her hand on the doorframe. Then she went to her stool and sat down, and started her morning preparations in better light than she'd had since arriving. She did not ask where the lamp had come from. The binding oath came on the last cold night of winter's final month. Sigrid knew the ceremony by structure. Every Alpha King of Stormveld renewed his claim before his people at the winter's end. A declaration of alliances, intentions, and, when the time had come, his chosen companion. The Félag, the bond declaring before witnesses. It was not required to name a mate at every oath, but if a king passed his third consecutive renewal without one, the council's pressure would shift from suggestion to formal demand. The line of succession was not an abstract concern in the north. She knew all of this from Bera, from the old weaponsmith, from Pip, the young kitchen girl who had become her self-appointed assistant and her most reliable source of fortress intelligence. She had cataloged the information without attaching significance to it, beyond its practical content. She attended as fortress healer, standing with the household staff in the eastern colonnade of the Great Hall. 200 people, every torch lit, the hall smelling of pine resin and packed bodies, and cold iron brought in from outside, breath misting faintly in the air above the crowd, despite the fires. She had a clear sightline to the firestone at the far end, which was where Halvard stood when he entered from the north door. He wore dark, formal wool and his grandfather's sword belt, the silver fittings catching the torchlight. He had dressed plainly, the way he did most things. Nothing excessive, nothing performative, everything exactly sufficient. He looked like what he was, a man who had been doing this job for a long time and intended to continue. She watched him with the attention she gave all things she cared about professionally. He spoke the oath in the old tongue, the words familiar from childhood hearing. The claim of the land, the protection of the people, the renewal of all bonds existing. His voice carried to every corner of the hall without effort. Not loudness, projection. The voice of someone who had learned early that you did not need to raise your voice if you meant what you said. "And for the Felag," he said, and Sigrid felt the hall's collective attention sharpen to a point. The held breath of 200 people. "I name Astrid of Greyvast, daughter of the Northern Council, as my intended." The hall responded. Correct, measured, the sound of political satisfaction. A cheer that told her more about the council's relief than about any genuine joy. Sigrid placed her hand flat against her sternum, adjusting the clasp of her overdress. The clasp did not need adjusting. She left her hand there for a moment, feeling her own heartbeat under her palm. Steady, unhelpful, continuing regardless of what she told it. Then her hand fell back to her side. She had not been expecting anything. She was absolutely certain, standing in the eastern colonnade with the torchlight moving across the crowd, that she had not been expecting anything. She was here as fortress healer. She had a professional relationship with this man and a professional regard for his well-being. She had treated his wound in a forest. She had reorganized his grandfather's apothecary. He had left a lamp on her work table, and she had never asked him about it, and they had occupied the same space for 4 months with a quality of careful attention between them that she had chosen, deliberately and rationally, not to name. She had not been expecting anything. The heat that moved through her chest and then went cold was therefore inconvenient, and she treated it the way she treated all inconvenient physical responses, by noting it, allowing it to exist without amplifying it, and waiting for it to pass. The ceremony continued around her. She stood correctly, her face held correctly, her breathing remained correct. The words that might have been given to what she felt moved through her, and she did not let them become sentences, because sentences were commitments, and she did not make commitments to things she could not act on. She became aware, at some point during the latter ceremonial exchanges, of being watched. Not the ambient awareness of being in a crowd, a specific, directed attention. She tracked it without turning her head. The slight change in the quality of peripheral vision that told her where to look, and found, at the far edge of the northern colonnade, a man she did not recognize. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, with the particular posture of someone who held authority easily enough that they had stopped needing to display it. He was not watching the ceremony. He was watching her. Not with interest, not with the look of a man cataloging an attractive woman. With assessment, the same quality she used herself, looking at something she wanted to understand. When her gaze reached him directly, he did not look away. He gave a slight, deliberate nod. She did not nod back. When the ceremony concluded and the hall shifted into the social movement of the post-oath gathering, Sigrid walked toward the eastern door. She measured her steps, not hurried, not slow, exactly the pace of a woman who knew where she was going. The hall was loud around her, voices layered over voices, and the warmth of packed bodies made the air heavy. Each step had more weight in it than steps normally had. The room's proportions had changed slightly, longer between her and the door, the ceiling lower than it had been before the oath. She fixed her attention on the door ahead and kept walking, and she did not look toward the firestone, where Halvard stood receiving congratulations she could hear in the tonal quality of the voices nearest to him. At the door, she paused. Her hand touched her sternum once more, not adjusting anything, just touching, the way a person touches a bruise they are deciding whether to press further. She felt her own breath moving in and out. She counted it. Then she straightened her spine to its full height, inclined her head to the honor guard in the correct degree, and walked out into the cold corridor. The door closed behind her. The hall noise diminished to a murmur, and then to nothing as she walked. She left on the 4th morning after the oath. This required no dramatic preparation. She had always kept her bag ready. It was the first thing she had established at Stormveld. Because a healer who could not travel at an hour's notice was a healer who chose her own comfort over her patient's need. She packed the remainder in the pre-dawn dark. herb stalks into their travel cases, tools wrapped in linen, the written record she had compiled over 4 months in their oilskin folder. She moved efficiently, without ceremony. She left the lamp on the work table. It had come with the room. Bera found her in the east corridor at first light, pack on her shoulder, and looked at it with the expression of a woman who had expected this and had been hoping to be wrong. "He doesn't know what he's doing," Bera said. Not, "don't go." Not, "you're making a mistake." A statement of fact, offered plainly, the way Bera offered most things. "That may be true." Sigrid adjusted the pack strap, "but that's not my problem to solve." He had no choice with the council. "I know." Bera was quiet for a moment. "He asked me about the lamp, whether you'd mentioned the light being insufficient. I told him you hadn't." Sigrid said nothing. "He said, 'I know, that's why I had to look.'" Bera looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this because you should have the true information. Not because I think it changes what you've decided." "It doesn't change it." Sigrid met her eyes. "It's not about what he feels. It's about what he chose when the moment came, and what I need to be able to live in a place. I can't be invisible here. Not even quietly." Bera nodded once, the nod of a woman who understood and did not argue with understanding. "Northern Gate is unguarded at this hour." "I know," Sigrid said. "I'm taking the main gate." Something moved across Bera's face. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. "Snow by nightfall," she said. "Move before midday if you want the south road clear." Sigrid walked the length of Stormveld from east to west, past the herb room, past the hall, past the training yard, where boot prints had cut their patterns in the ice she had memorized from her window during 4 months of working before dawn. She walked without slowing, without looking for anyone. She walked through the main gate in full morning light with the gate guards present, and they stood aside without a word, and she went through. The south road was white and empty and cold, and she walked it. A mile out, something in her chest went quiet in a way that was not peace. The bond between fated pairs was old knowledge, sagas and grandmothers, the kind of certainty she had always filed under possible but unverified, requires more evidence. But something in her had been running at a low, warm frequency since the pine forest, since a man's hand warm beneath her fingers, and a voice saying, "I'll remember this," with the weight of someone who meant it. That frequency dropped. Not emotion, something more physical than that, something that lived in the tissue rather than the mind. A warmth that had existed at a constant low pitch, the kind you stop noticing until it stops. She felt its absence like stepping out of firelight into the dark. She kept walking. She did not look back at the fortress on its rock behind her. 1 foot, the next, the road south. Halvard was in the war council when it happened. A physical thing, not a thought, landing in his chest like a coal dropped from the hearth. Cold, where something had been warm. He was halfway through the grain report. He finished it. He gave the border rotation assignments, heard the dispute from the Eastern settlement, made the ruling on the Eriksson inheritance that had been pending for 2 weeks. All of it correctly, all of it completed, with an expression that answered Brennan's twice-glanced question before it could be asked aloud. When the room cleared, Brennan stayed. "She left through the main gate," Brennan said, not carefully, just plainly, in the manner of a man who had been waiting for the right moment and had run out of patience waiting for it. 4 days ago. Daylight. No hood, no haste. She let the gate guard see her face. He paused. "That's a message, Halvard." "Not a retreat." "I know what it is." "Do you?" Brennan set a folder on the table between them. "I pulled her record this morning. You should read it before you decide what to do." He left. Halvard sat alone in the war room with the folder in front of him for a long time before he opened it. Sigrid of Ulfheim, healer. Arrived under her own written conditions, which Bera had apparently found sufficiently unusual to attach to the file. He read them. Autonomy over healing chambers. No orders about patient treatment from any party, including the king. He remembered Bera's face when she had delivered these conditions to him. The barely contained amusement. He had said, "Accept them." Bera had said, "I thought you would." Cases treated in 4 months, 47. Deaths during those cases, 0, including 2 fever cases that the previous healer's records indicated would likely not have survived winter. 3 births, all safe, including the Johansson infant, who had been presenting incorrectly and who was now, by last report, healthy and loud. Previous 4 years under the last healer, 11 deaths from conditions Sigrid's methods would have caught. He sat with that number. Below the case records, in Beata's precise handwriting, warriors now present for treatment before injuries become critical. First time under any healer in recorded fortress history. Staff in the East Wing report consistently that she is efficient, honest, and does not make people feel stupid for being hurt. This is worth noting. And below that, a separate entry. Oil lamp, East Wing. His request, 4th week of her residency. I delivered it before dawn. She was not there yet. She never asked where it came from, and never mentioned the previous light being insufficient. I was told by the night watch that she worked by it every morning from that point. Halvard read this line 3 times. She had adapted to the poor light for 3 weeks without complaint. She had worked around it, the way she apparently worked around everything, by finding the method that functioned regardless of circumstance. He had noticed, not because she had told him, not because she had asked, but because he had paid enough attention to see it, and he had done something about it, and she had used what he gave her and never made it into something it might have been. She never asked where it came from. Because she had known, he thought. She had known, and she had chosen not to name it, the way she had chosen not to name a number of things over 4 months. And he had made the same choice, and they had both been very careful and very correct. And then the council had come with their numbers and their arguments about northern alliances and the line of succession, and he had stood in the great hall and done the correct thing. The correct thing. He stood at the war room window and looked at the south road, which was pale and empty in the afternoon light. Somewhere on it, 4 days ago, Sigrid had walked away in daylight through the main gate and had not hurried and had not hidden. He stood there a long time. He did not immediately call for his horse. The Northern Healers' Conclave met at Halvard, 2 days south, and Sigrid arrived on the 3rd morning of its gathering, with her bag and her case notes, and the particular clarity of a person who has made a decision and is acting on it. Sigrid of Ulfheim, she wrote in the register. Her own name, complete, unqualified. The conclave was a community of practice. 24 healers from across the northern territories, trading techniques, arguing methodology, conducting the specific kind of professional disagreement that only happens between people who respect each other enough to fight seriously. She fit into it immediately, and well. Her mortality records from Stormveld generated real interest. The numbers were the kind that changed practice, the kind other healers wanted to understand and replicate. By the 2nd day, she had been asked to present her winter fever protocol to the full gathering. She did. It went well. She ate her meals with the other healers, and slept in the conclave's guest house, and woke each morning without dreaming about a particular lamp lit in a dark room before dawn. And if occasionally something in her chest ran at a slightly lower temperature than it had 4 months ago, that was a thing that would resolve with time and work and the company of competent people who valued what she did. On the 3rd evening, Cassian of the Northern Alliance sat down across from her at the fireside. She knew the name before she knew the face. Most people in the North did. He led the Alliance's council, held territory across 3 settlements, and had spent the past decade building a political structure in the North that operated independently of any single fortress's authority. He was, in the way of powerful men who had stopped needing to perform their power, easy to underestimate if you weren't paying attention. Sigrid was always paying attention. "You left Stormveld," he said. His tone was conversational, which meant it wasn't. My term concluded, she said. His expression indicated that he knew the circumstances were more complex than that, and that he was choosing not to push on it. She appreciated the choice. I've been watching Stormveld's outcome data for 2 years. Your 4 months there produced results that outperformed the previous 4-year period on every metric that matters. He held his cup without drinking from it, a habit, she noticed, of a man who used objects as anchors while he thought. The Northern Alliance is building a central healing house at Halvard. We need a director. Someone with your methodology and your... He paused, and she had the impression he was choosing the right word rather than the polished one. Precision. Sigrid looked into the fire. What does the position involve? He laid it out. The facility's scope, the staffing structure, the reach across Alliance settlements. It was real work. Serious work. The kind of position that would require everything she had and produce something that would outlast her. She felt the genuine pull of it and did not dismiss that pull. And the Alliance's interest, she said carefully, extends beyond the directorship. He met her eyes. I think you already know the answer to that. I do. She set down her cup. Say it plainly, Cassian. I don't work well with things left half said. Something moved across his face, something that might have been appreciation in a man who valued directness. The Alliance needs a political partner as well as a medical one. Someone whose credibility extends into both spheres. Someone who is not entangled with Stormveld. He paused. I am proposing a longer arrangement. I won't rush you toward an answer. The directorship stands regardless of what you decide about the rest. Sigrid sat with this. The offer was real. Cassian was real. Not a man performing interest, not a political convenience wearing a friendly face. He was a person she could respect, and possibly in time, more than respect. And the work he was describing was exactly the kind she had spent her whole adult life trying to find access to. She was turning it over in her mind, genuinely, when one of the younger healers appeared at her side. Sigrid. The girl's voice was careful, in a way that raised Sigrid's attention before the next words came. There's a man at the outer gate. He came alone. No escort, no sigil on his coat. He told the gatekeeper his name is Halvard, and that he is here without title. The fire crackled. Cassian watched her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read answers in faces rather than words. Sigrid set down her cup with exact steadiness and stood. He was at the outer gate, exactly as described. Alone. No horse visible. He must have left it somewhere outside. Plain wool coat, dark and travel-worn. No weapons she could see at his hip. He was standing in the snow on the far side of the gate with his arms at his sides, and he was not pacing, not braced for confrontation, not positioned to argue. He was simply there. Standing in the snow outside a gate, having traveled 2 days from his own fortress without escort, rank, or apparent plan. The gatekeeper opened the gate for Sigrid. She stepped through, and it closed behind her. 10 feet of cold air between them. She had prepared, walking from the fireside to the gate, a series of accurate and necessary things she had the right to say. She had organized them. They were ready. Sigrid, he said. Just that, her name, without anything after it, which put all the weight inside the name itself. She had heard him say her name in many contexts over 4 months. Professional contexts, the brief contexts of corridor encounters, once in her herb room when he had come in and she had not yet looked up. She had catalogued all of them without attaching significance. This was different. This had the quality of something irreducible, like the thing itself, stripped of all the careful layers that had been placed over it. The binding oath stands, she said. Her voice came out level. You named your phaelog before the full court. I dissolved it. The snow moved between them in the low wind off the north hills. You, Astrid of Gravast, consented. The council did not, and will not, and they will raise it again at the next oath cycle, and the one after that. He said this as she had heard him give field reports. Factual. No performance of certainty he did not have. Those are real problems. I have no clean solutions to them. I'm not here to offer you things I can't deliver. Sigrid was quiet. I stood in that hall, he said, and made the correct political decision. And I watched you walk out the eastern door, and I understood, standing there receiving congratulations, that I had just made the worst mistake of my adult life. He paused. I don't say that to move you. I say it because you told me in a pine forest that pain is honest. And that's the honest thing. She looked at his face. He was cold, had clearly been traveling in this weather long enough for it to show in his color, his cheeks rough with windburn, frost on his collar. He was a man who had ridden 2 days alone into territory that was not his, without the protections of his title or his guard, and he was standing in the snow outside a gate and not asking for anything. He had come to a point and stopped, and was simply present in it, waiting for whatever she decided. She thought about all the things she had not let herself name over 4 months. The lamp. The way he occupied the chair in her herb room, as though the chair had been waiting for him. The quality of his attention when she spoke. Not polite attention, not the attention of someone waiting for their turn, but genuine interest in the specific content of what she said. The way he had stood in the pine forest bleeding and looked at her with the full consideration of those gray eyes, as though she was a thing worth the full consideration of those eyes. She reached into her coat pocket. She had almost forgotten she had it. She had carried it since Ulfheim out of habit, a sample from her stores, tucked in for the journey, and drew out a small linen pouch. She held it. He reached into his own coat. He withdrew an identical, small linen pouch. They looked at each other. She opened hers first. Hrosseling. Horse heather, low-growing, frost-tolerant, the kind that survived under old pine roots. He opened his. The same. I went back to the forest, he said quietly, where you found me. I didn't know what to bring. I'm not. He stopped. I'm not good at the words. I knew that before I rode here, and I know it now. But I knew what was real, and that was the real thing. And I thought perhaps you would accept something real over something said correctly. Sigrid looked at the hrosseling in his hand. Then she looked at his face. The control was still there, the careful mastery over expression that he had developed over years of doing a job that required you to show the right things to the right people at the right times. But beneath it, through it, something was showing that the mastery had not been built to conceal, because he had never expected to need to conceal it. Something that existed without asking her permission to exist. He was afraid. Not of her, not of rejection in the ordinary sense. She understood that he was a man who had faced things that would have broken most people and had not broken. He was afraid in the way of someone who has recognized for the first time exactly what is at stake and cannot control the outcome, and is looking at it directly anyway. You should know, she said, that there is a credible man inside that gate who has made me a real offer, real work that matters. He is not a villain, and he is not a pretense. He is someone I could build a good life alongside. I know. His voice did not change. I know you have options. You've always had options. I'm not here because I think you have nowhere else to go. Then why are you here? Because I would rather stand in the cold outside a gate and hear you say no than be warm inside a fortress knowing I never came. The wind moved through the space between them. Sigrid looked at the hrosseling in her own hand. She had picked it up 4 days ago, before leaving Stormveld, from the store she was packing. A handful of the herb from the pine forest, from the first morning she had come here, with conditions written on a folded piece of parchment, and something careful in her chest. She had carried it without deciding why. She understood now why. She extended her hand toward him, palm up, the pouch of heather resting in it. An offering, or a question, or simply the true thing. He looked at her hand. Then, slowly, he placed his hand under hers. not taking the pouch, just holding her hand from beneath, his palm large and warm against her cold fingers, his thumb lying still against her wrist, where her pulse was doing something she had given up trying to regulate. They stood there. The cold was still the cold. The gate was still closed behind her. Cassian was somewhere on the other side of it, with his real offer and his patient regard, and all the legitimate reasons she had found, standing at a fireside 30 minutes ago, to stay. She would go back inside and tell him, honestly. He would accept it, honestly. He was that kind of man. But her hand was in Halvard's hand in the snow, outside a gate in the early dark, and both of them were still, and the cold seemed to have lost something of its insistence. She returned to Stormveld 3 weeks later. Not because he had asked her to. He hadn't. He had come back to Halvard for one night after she went back inside to speak to Cassian, who received the news with exactly the equanimity she had expected of him, and who told her, as he'd said before, that the offer of the directorship remained open on its own merits, and that she should send him her fever protocols regardless. And in the morning, Halvard had looked at her across the conclave's main hall, with an expression she was learning to read. I will wait, however long. She had nodded once, and he had left, and she had finished her business at the conclave properly. She consulted her case notes. She wrote the fever protocols for Cassian's healers. She spent 3 evenings in honest conversation with herself about what she wanted and what was true, and what she was choosing versus what she was falling into, because she did not intend to confuse those categories. Then she packed her bag and took the North Road. Bera was in the courtyard when she arrived, in the late afternoon of a clear, cold day, as though she had simply been passing through and happened to time it correctly. East Wing, Bera said. Herb store's untouched. I told the staff. Thank you. The lamp is still there? A pause. Minimal, precisely weighted. The wick needed trimming. I trimmed it last week. Sigrid looked at her. I assumed you'd be back, Bera said, with her near amusement. I didn't know when. Sigrid set down her bag and stood in the Stormveld courtyard and looked up at the east tower. Her tower, its window catching the last of the afternoon light. 4 months of work. Her reorganized jars, the case notes she had built from nothing, the morning rounds she had established, the warriors who had learned, against the considerable resistance of their entire professional culture, that asking for treatment before an injury became critical was not weakness. Where is he? She asked. Training yard. He's been there most of this week. Bera did not say waiting, but the word was present in the sentence regardless. Sigrid put her bag in her room first. She reorganized 2 jars that had drifted from their assigned positions. She checked the herb stalks, confirmed the lamp, trimmed the wick more precisely. She let herself have 5 minutes in her own space, her own order, her own ground. Then she went to the training yard. He saw her before she came through the gate. She saw the moment his eyes found her across the yard, the slight halt in his movement. His training partner took one look at his face, said something she couldn't hear, and found productive business elsewhere. Halvard walked toward her across the packed snow yard, not hurrying, and stopped a few feet from where she stood. You came back, he said. I told you at Halvard that I needed 3 weeks. You did. I needed to think about what I was choosing and make sure it was a choice and not something else. She held his gaze steadily. It's a choice. I've accounted for the council, for the Phalog problem, for the complications that will continue and probably get worse before they get better. I've accounted for all of it, and I've decided anyway. He was very still. But I need you to hear what I'm asking for, she continued. I need you to tell me things, not explain decisions after they've already been made. Tell me while there's still room. I need to be in the room where it matters, not informed of it afterward. That's not a preference. It's a requirement. The silence lasted long enough that she understood what it contained. This was genuinely difficult for him. He was a man who had made decisions alone for a long time, and had built his authority on never needing to explain himself. She was asking him to dismantle something structural, not just change a habit. "I'll learn it," he said finally. "It won't come naturally." "I know. I have experience treating things that don't come naturally." She almost smiled. "I'm willing to be patient if you're willing to try." The winter light was going amber around them, the training yard going quiet as the day's last drills ended. He reached out slowly. She could see him being deliberate about it, about the slowness, about giving her the moment to choose, and pushed a loose strand of her hair back from her face with one careful hand. Not claiming, just touching. The touch of someone who had thought about doing this many times and was now allowing himself to do it. She did not move away. "I'm going to the herb room," she said. "And then I'm going to eat something. And tomorrow I'm going to reorganize the East Corridor medical supplies, which from what I saw on my way in have returned to complete chaos." "They have," he agreed. "Good. I'll see you at morning meal." She walked back through the training yard and did not look behind her. But she heard nothing. No retreat, no voice calling after her. Just the sound of him remaining where she'd left him, watching her go. She smiled, just briefly, facing forward. The next morning, gray light very early. The smell of pine smoke rising from the first fires. The sound of the fortress beginning. Distant voices, the scrape of the portcullis chain. Pip's footsteps in the corridor doing their characteristic failed attempt at quiet. Sigrid dressed in the dark, by memory, and went to her herb room. The lamp was already lit. She stood in the doorway looking at it, the warm, steady circle of light on her work table, the copper reflector angled precisely, the wick trimmed to the exact width that gave maximum light without smoking. Someone had been here before dawn. Someone had considered the angle of the reflector and the height of the wick, and had made adjustments based on specific knowledge of how she worked. She crossed to her stool, sat, pulled the morning's first preparation toward her, and began. 20 minutes later, footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, specific. The particular rhythm she had catalogued and memorized against her better intentions in her very first weeks here. The rhythm that was his and no one else's. The footsteps paused at her open door. "You started before dawn," Halvard said. "I always start before dawn." She did not look up from the compound she was grinding. "There's tea on the stone if you want it." A pause. The sound of him crossing the room. The particular quiet of him settling into the chair across from the work table, not standing over her, not occupying the space between her and her work, simply present in the way she had noticed he was learning, taking up exactly the space he occupied, and no more. The way of someone paying careful attention to a new thing. She heard him lift the cup. She heard him drink. Outside, snow had begun. The first real fall of the new season. Light, exploratory, the kind that softened every sound in the courtyard and made the world feel briefly intimate. The scale of it shrunk to what was contained by walls and firelight. Neither of them spoke. The grinding continued. The fire shifted. The snow fell in the high window. She thought, without intending to, this is what I came back for. Not the grand gesture in the snow, not the declaration outside the gate. This. A lamp lit before I arrived. A man in a chair drinking tea and not filling the silence with things it doesn't need. The ordinary morning, freely chosen, which is worth more than any number of extraordinary ones that aren't. Love, she had decided in her 3 weeks of thinking, was not a thing that happened to you. It was a decision made in full knowledge of the costs. It was choosing the lamplighter and the difficult conversation and the complications that would not resolve cleanly, choosing all of it with clear eyes, and finding the choice sound. Outside, the snow. Inside, the grinding of herbs, the fire, the steam from a cup of tea, the particular silence of two people who had decided. She glanced up. He was watching her work. Not her face, her hands. The the way she moved through the task with the efficiency of deep practice. His expression was the one she had learned to read over months. Attention. The real kind. The kind that does not need to announce itself. He felt her look. He met her eyes. Nothing was said. The morning continued, ordinary and chosen and entirely sufficient. Sigrid never asked to be chosen. She asked for something quieter and far more difficult. To be seen. Not as a prize, not as a political solution, not as a woman who survived and should therefore be grateful for whatever came next. She asked to matter in the ordinary moments. In a lamp lit before dawn. In a chair across a work table. In a man who listened not to reply, but to understand. And Halvard, a king who had spent years making every right decision, learned, at great cost, that the right decision and the true decision are not always the same thing. That power does not protect you from the moment you realize you have chosen correctly by every standard that matters to everyone else, and wrongly by the only standard that matters to you. This story is not really about a king and a healer. It is about two people who had both, in different ways, learned to take up less space than they deserved, and what happened when they stopped. Love, at its quietest and most honest, is not a feeling that overwhelms you. It is a choice you make with clear eyes, in full knowledge of the cost, and find sound anyway. A lamp lit before you arrive, a gate you choose to open, a morning you decide to stay. If Sigrid's story stayed with you even a little, drop a comment and tell me, which moment hit you hardest? The lamp, the gate, or the morning after? Your answers genuinely make me want to keep writing these. Like the video if you want more. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And thank you, truly, for spending your time here with these characters. It means more than you know.